Hey everybody, it's Dami and Jamie, and welcome to another episode of Hometown History. We are in the McGee Room at the Burning Bridge Tavern in Wrightsville. And for our in-person guests, I just want to tell you that you can order food up at the bar and then bring it back here. There's some ice water over there, and the bathrooms are down the ramp and to your left. So when you do get your food, your little buzzer's gonna start buzzing really loudly. So if you can please go get your food quickly so it doesn't sound like we're setting off fire alarms, that would be wonderful.
All right, so tonight's presentation, thank you so much for coming out and listening to this in person and squeezing in this room. There was a lot of interest on Facebook, and I told the owners of Burning Bridge, who did not charge us, by the way, so thank you to them for supporting local history. I said expect about 40 people. We're probably at, I don't know.
Everybody give a cheer so the people online can hear how many people are in here. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
So you all came out tonight because you wanted to hear more about the story of Hex Hollow, the murder that happened here in York County, as well as the history of Pennsylvania Dutch practice of powwowing. So here's our agenda for tonight.
Yeah, so we always have an agenda, and we're going to start with what is powwow. So some of you might not know that, but you're going to learn tonight. Then we're going to talk about powwow stories from York County. Then we're going to talk about the Hex backstory, the murder that happened, and the lessons that were learned from that event.
And then stay tuned after Dami and I present for about 30 to 40 minutes. We're going to take a small break, and then we're going to have a guest speaker come up. So we'll have our extra, which is considered the second portion. The entirety of tonight's presentation will last about an hour.
Yes.
Okay. So we want you to learn as much as you can in the next hour and soak it all in. But we have 4 different takeaways for you to consider as you're watching tonight. The first is that this is a serious topic. A man died, and it showed also that this person for a long time, Nelson Rehmeyer, was viewed as a perpetrator and a witch in our history, but we're going to try to correct that and show that he was a man, he was a farmer, and he was, murdered. Mm-hmm. The second is that this murder put York County on the international map, and not for a good thing. It was bad for our notoriety. Second is that powwowing is this beautiful, unique cultural expression of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And because of this murder, it really went into its decline. And today, I don't know of any known powwowers. If you know of someone that's still practicing today, please save that for the end. We'd love to have your comments. And then at the end, the justice system in this case worked, and it calmed the community on edge. You're going to hear tonight about how concerned people were and the issues that it caused in our community, but the justice system worked. A little bit about me. My name is Jamie Norpel. I used to be a high school history teacher at Milton Hershey School. Now I work in downtown York for the York County Safety Collab. I also run a blog with Jim McClure. He's our wizard behind the curtain over here and our third hometown history person. It's called Witnessing York, and then I have a YDR local history blog called Wondering in York County.
She's a very busy woman. I'm Dami Miller. I am the Third Circuit Court of Appeals librarian for the Middle District of Pennsylvania in Harrisburg. In my free time, I run Preserving the History of Newburytown on Facebook, and I'm a Civil War reenactor with the 87th Pennsylvania.
And you just presented last weekend, right?
Yeah, I've been very busy as well.
Yes, you have.
So the Hex murders and powwowing is more than just a topic that comes up at Halloween. The murders actually took place around Thanksgiving, but because powwowing and the Hex murders and witchcraft are sort of associated with the Halloween season, this is the time of year that it comes up, but it gets really overlooked when it actually happened, which was the Thanksgiving season.
Yep.
So hence why we're doing this episode in October and not November.
Yeah. Yep. So let's dive into then our first topic on what is powwow. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever heard of powwowing before.
Everybody.
All right, pretty much everyone, or some people were just scared to raise their hand. So let's get into what this is. So like we said, it's Pennsylvania Dutch. And so this came from Germany. When we had Germans, who we know were a large portion that came over to Pennsylvania, they adapted to the flora and the fauna that we had here. And so they created their own unique tradition with the Pennsylvania Dutch called powwowing. And what powwowing is it's really a blend of protective arts and healing.
Yeah, so powwow derives from German. Mm-hmm. And how do you say that? Brauch?
My husband was teaching me on the way. He was learning German earlier. Brock.
I'm the Italian in the group, not the German in the group. But you can see that the word powwow seems to have been borrowed from Native Americans. So there's, your Christian influence with the German, and then there's the Native American influence in there as well.
Yep. They use a lot of incantations and a lot of herbs. And so what the basis of powwowing was, it came from this book called The Long Lost Friends. It's by John George Homan, and it's published the whole way back in 1820. You can buy it on Amazon. Does anyone own The Long Lost Friends?
Oh, we've got a few.
Yeah.
Oh,
we have a copy. Okay, we might be looking at that later. So this is, I highly encourage you to look at it. You can actually look at it on Google Play online, a digital version. But this is a collection of what's called mysterious and invaluable arts and remedies to heal men as well as animals. And so if you open it up, it was kind of like a recipe book or a guide for farmers and for the layperson to figure out what was happening on their farm. Because this is in the 1800s. This is before the internet, right? This is before you could just research things, and also before science. I mean, the science existed, of course, but do you realize that germ theory hadn't even been invented yet?
Right.
So farmers were looking for reasons that, why are my livestock dying? Why are people getting sick? My tooth hurts. What can I do to help it? And so the Long Lost Friend gave people, in a way, a lot of empowerment to cure themselves, to heal themselves from the land, and by also their Christian beliefs, because a lot of it's all rooted in Christianity. So we want to dispel that. A lot of people might think that it is like hexery or that it is black magic, but it is not. It's based in Christianity.
Yeah, like Jamie just said, it's all about protection. You want to protect yourself, your family, your crops, and your livestock, because that's your livelihood. And if you can't heal your family, heal your crops, heal your livestock, you're not going to be making any money. So really, it was essential for them to find ways that they could heal each other and protect themselves.
Yep. So here are some of the things that were in it as well. Crops, cattle.
Christian theology and shamanistic practices were included. It guards against witches and robbers. So obviously it's not witchcraft if you're guarding against witches. So that's where that, Christian element comes in. It's protecting, again, your family, practical uses for home remedies. So I don't think a lot of people will associate the home remedies that they're using today with powwow, but hey, that might be, where it originated.
So if you were to purchase this book and open it up, you'll see what we're considering spells, right? Incantations, charms, benedictines, amulets, talisman, palindromes, herbs, elixirs, and portions of animal parts. So let me back up for a second. You can begin to see how this could be considered witchcraft, right? And yeah, there are some parallels.
Yeah, so the legend had it that simply carrying the book of Christian magic helped to ward off supernatural forces. So that was your protection right there. As long as you had the book with you, no one could cast a spell on you. No one could put a hex on you. So, there was definitely some superstition added into it.
Yep.
But, the gentleman right here that has the book, he's safe tonight.
Yeah. And a lot of it is rooted in truth. So here is a picture. So my mother is very much into herbs and creating her own medicines and teas. And so here is some essential oil that she made with calendula. And so I just want to bring history forward and realize that a lot of us are still practicing a lot of the things that our ancestors have been doing for hundreds of years. I mean, my Aunt Sherry's here, and every time she's at my house watching my son on Wednesday, she picks my tea and she makes a spearmint tea, right? So, I mean, we're living from the earth and we're still very much a part of it.
Right. So do anyone in the room, do you know someone that's been powwowed?
We're going to... Oh, okay.
And if you know someone online, if someone's watching online, put in the comments, but we're going to come back to this question later, and we want you to share your stories at the end when we do the question and answer. But if you're online watching, please comment in the comments and we'll read it for you. Jim, our wizard over here on the computer, will read the comments later.
And I also didn't see my family raise their hand in the back. Our family was powwowed. Everyone look at my family in the back. Yes, turn and make, yes.
Hi, Jamie's family.
Dami and I are super lucky to have friends and family who support us. So thank you very much for coming out tonight, guys. So let's dive into then some of the examples in Long Lost Friends. So I was looking through it and I found this one. It was very interesting. They said, if you have a toothache, what do you do? You probably take Tylenol, Advil, put some ice on it, call your dentist. Could people 200 years ago do that? No, right? They either had to pull their tooth or they had to figure it out. So in The Long Lost Friend, here was one of their solutions. He said, if you take blue vitriol, which is copper sulfate, and put a piece of it in the hollow tooth, yet not too much, spit out the water that collects in the mouth, and be careful to swallow none. I do not know whether it is good for teeth that are not hollow, but I should judge it should cure any kind of toothache. Okay, so this is copper sulfate. I did some research, and I looked at the National Library of Medicine, and they did some research on hamsters. So sorry, hamsters. But if you look, the effects of copper fluoride and copper sulfate, and I know you can't read it, but I outlined in red that it did have positive effects on toothaches. So isn't this interesting that this book that's 200 years old, who was making stuff up, was actually rooted in true things that did help?
Right, and then there's more. So this is an interesting one. So take 6 hen's eggs and boil them in hot ashes until they are right hard. And then take the yellow of the eggs and fry them in a gill of lard until they're quite black. And then put a handful of rue with it, and afterward filter it through a cloth. When this is done, add a gill of sweet oil to it. It will take most effect where the plaster of a female is prepared by a male and the plaster of a male is prepared by a female. So you have to follow these directions, I'm sure, to a T for it to work correctly.
So one of the most common afflictions that were addressed in Long Lost Friends, well, do you want to guess? You want to guess what the most common afflictions were?
Be brave. Someone say something.
Starts with a W and ends with arts.
Warts.
Yes, warts. So warts were commonly addressed in the book.
And then they had spells as well. So ye thieves, I conjure you to be obedient like Jesus Christ. So there you're getting the Christian aspect of it, who obeyed his heavenly Father unto the cross, and to stand without moving out of my sight in the name of the Trinity. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but you can tell that, you know, obviously there is what they call a spell, but it has a Christian aspect to it. So I can see why people were getting a little superstitious when someone's, you know, casting a spell over you, even if it's for protection and it's not something, you know, necessarily bad.
Right. But I mean, today we would call this praying. Okay, right? It's people just bringing positive affirmations and talking to God. And so, again, we're trying to separate that powwowing was known as this dangerous, you know, hex. It really wasn't.
And the intentions were good.
Yeah. So just to be clear, when we consider white magic, which you could consider powwowing, I guess, you know, white magic, that it's using the long lost friend for healing and protection, but black magic would be putting a curse on someone or trying to harm another person.
Yeah, so obviously we're in York County, and we've asked everyone in the room and online if they've been powwowed, if they know someone that's been powwowed, if they have family members that were powwowing. So when we were, you know, researching this, and when we put the topic out there, the stories just start flooding in. So York County has a really, you know, rich history of powwowing. So you can see up here, this is from Linda Gent, and she says, "Thanks for sharing, Jim McClure. 2 of my siblings and I were blessed to have known a man with the incredible gift. And even though you didn't have to be a believer for powwowing to work, after seeing the results 3 times, I'm a believer. Thank you to your grandpa." So, you know, there are a lot of people willing to come forward saying, you know, I've seen it do good things. Mm-hmm. So that helps dispel some of the myths around it.
Yep, absolutely. Here's another one. So her name was Jane Crodner, and she went to one of Jim's talks. He gave a talk on the lessons from the Hex.
He talks about this a lot, in case you were wondering.
And so she decided to, after she was done hearing what happened to Nelson Rehmeyer, she went back and she painted this beautiful picture. And she said, "My grandmother used the powwow woman's treatments, and I waited outside in his car." She wrote, "Powwow doctors combine folk magic and religion with healing rituals to care for maladies in humans and livestock." So this is a picture of one of the farms that she went to when her father was powwowed. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting, too, that both men and women could be powwow doctors. And again, this is the 1800s, so I think it's an egalitarian practice.
Yeah, because I think when you think of shamans, you think of men. When you think of witches, you think of women.
Yep.
So, men and women, it was an equal opportunity activity for powwowing. And again, more stories. We have Eric Lowe that says there was a lady that lived near McKinley School that practiced. Grandpa took aunt there because her hands were cracked and bleeding. She put cobwebs on them and said an incantation, and it worked. She wouldn't take money, so Grandpa left groceries on the porch. So you can see now that we're bartering for this healing power. Not everyone's willing to take money for it. They were doing it, out of the kindness of their heart. But I've definitely never heard of cobwebs healing cracked skin before, but I'll take his word for it.
Nope.
So now we're going to give you a little information on the backstory of Hex. So hexing is different than powwowing, but who knows where this location is? Oh, a lot of people in the room. Someone yell it out.
So this is known as Rehmeyer's Hollow now, right?
Yep.
Absolutely. And this is Nelson Rehmeyer's house. So here is just a map to kind of orient you so you can see where you are. If you look near the top, it's not showing, but you can see kind of Lake Williams and Lake Redmond, right where it says 83. And then we're south between, like Stewartstown, so right above it. And then I also took a topographical picture just for you to see how many hills are around this and why it's called Hex Hollow. I mean, it really is
It's a hollow.
Yeah, it's a holler. It's a holler.
It is. So now we have to talk about the killers. So this is going to be interesting. Notice the ages of these people. So John Curry was 14 years old. Wilbert Hess was 18, and John Blymeyer was 32 years old. So I want you to keep that in the back of your head as we talk about this, that a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old with a 32-year-old got together and committed a murder.
Yep. So here's a picture of Nelson Rehmeyer. So Nelson Rehmeyer was a farmer. He was born the whole way back in 1868. He was described as a recluse, as odd, as maybe socialistic. And my husband thought it was funny. I always rehearse on the way down. I practice in the car and I kind of say it out loud. And he said, it's funny that we synonymize socialists with odd. And I'm like, yeah, that is kind of interesting. But for the time period in the United States, especially York County, we've always been very conservative. So it's interesting that people pointed out that he was a socialist and then they put that together with the clues are odd. Just interesting. So he was a powwow practitioner, and a kinsman named Jeanette Harvey described him as a very kind man.
Yeah.
So the three, this is yours.
Thank you. So all three of the assailants were impacted one way or another by powwowing. Either they had been powwowed, they knew someone that had been powwowed, and of course we're talking about the fact that hexes and hexery and witchcraft is different than powwowing. But unlike us, they were looking at powwowing as something dangerous, something that affected them in a negative way. But we have no evidence that Rehmeyer, who was a powwower, was using this for something bad or that he had ill intentions. But of course, unfortunately, these assailants really thought that he was practicing black magic. And, there's no evidence that he was.
Nope. So one of the notable people who know the most on this is Ross McGinnis. Has anyone in the room heard Ross McGinnis speak?
He's amazing.
Yeah, he knows his stuff. And so in his book, he describes Nelson Rehmeyer's wife, his name is Alice. She believed that he practiced black magic, right? Now, one thing to be careful is she referred to him as that devilish old witch. They also were separated, right? They didn't live together. So take that with a grain of salt when your, ex-wife, or at the time they never actually divorced, your, separated partner described you as that old witch, Yeah, things to say about your exes. But the community saw him as simply a misfit. So his neighbor, his name was Charles Miller. He thought that he was peculiar, described as an odd duck, but nothing dangerous.
Right, so they thought that there was no doubt in their minds that he was a witch and that he was practicing black magic. So these men went there thinking, that he was a real threat and that he was dangerous to not only them, but to the entire community. So I think you really have to get into their psyche about they thought they were doing something good, you know, as twisted and wrong as it really was. So their intention wasn't to do anything bad because they thought he was hurting them, but unfortunately they're the ones that end up hurting him.
Yep. And I just want for you to take a second to look at his face, right? Look at Blimeyer's face after the murder. He says later, "The witch is dead. I can eat and sleep in peace now." So he did not regret it. And I would say that face, if I were to describe it in a word, I would say at peace, content, resolute. He does not look like a man with remorse.
No.
Yep. So 2 of the 3 men knew the victim, Nelson Rehmeyer, and they actually visited his house the night before the murder.
So they were going there and they were trying to break a spell that they thought he had cast upon them. So they wanted to collect certain items to break this spell. So they needed the book, The Long Lost Friend. They needed his copy of it. And they needed a lock of his hair. And then they needed to bury that 6 feet under and behind the barn to break the spell. That's not what happened. It didn't go as planned, but apparently that was their intention. So that's what leads to the murder. And
so the murder was November 28, 1928. They went to Nelson Rehmeyer's house at 11:30 p.m. And like we already said, he was married to a woman named Alice, but they were estranged. She lived in a different home, so he was there by himself. They went to the Hollow to, like Dami said, break the spell. Because if you've read the literature or if you've watched the documentaries, you know that the trio visited another woman over in Lancaster who said that the way you break the spell is, like Dami said, you collect the book and collect a piece of his hair and bury it 6 feet down. And so they were following the orders of someone else. And again, just to reiterate, this was during a time when people fell out of control. There were no answers, and so they were given a solution. And so there were people who trying to bring autonomy to their life. So I don't necessarily want to blame them, but they did commit murder though. And so let's get into what happened.
They did. So they went there and it's a remote house. It's down in the Hollow. He's living alone at this time. And of course they go there to break the spell, but one thing leads to another and they end up breaking a chair over Rehmeyer's back. And they hit him with a log and they bludgeon him basically so that they can tie him up, and then they set his body on fire. And then they end up fleeing the scene without collecting any of the things they need to break the spell. So really things got out of control pretty quickly, but you have to remember there's a 14-year-old and an 18-year-old and a 32-year-old. So it's, you know, a strange group of people that came together, and I'm sure that their ages had something to do with that. I don't think a 14-year-old can perform under pressure very well, especially when things go off the rails as quickly as they did.
Yep. So so they tried to burn him and it did not work, right? It does not work. Interesting fun fact though, you know that it is legal in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania if you want to cremate your family members at home. It is actually legal. I talked to the coroner yesterday about it. I don't advise it. I don't know what that looks like.
Don't try this at home.
But it is your right to cremate a family member at home if you choose to do that.
Maybe like call the fire department ahead of time and give them a heads up.
And build a really hot fire. So a few days later, the neighbors begin to hear Nelson Rehmeyer's mule that had begun braying, right? So they heard the mule, and so that's when they went into the house. They said something's wrong, as they went uncovered that his body was there, and this was on Thanksgiving.
So all 3 men are arrested, and they all have 3 separate trials, and the trials start on January 1929, and they're all convicted. So Blimeyer got first-degree murder and life, Curry got first degree and life, and then Hess got second degree in 10 years. So it ends up being the biggest trial of the 20th century.
Yep. So here you can see some of the newspapers that came out. Murdered farmer to get lock of hair to break spell, 3 confess. It was followed internationally. There was even some people that heard about it later, and they said, oh, isn't York County, isn't the place that doesn't have a library? Right? So they're connecting, not having a, because does anyone know when Martin Library opened?
We covered this in a former episode.
It's not till the 1930s, right? And we declined a Carnegie Library when they wanted to bring it to York. We declined it and said, no, we can't cover the costs. So here we have someone murdered because of witchcraft, and then the country said, oh, yeah, York County, they're the ones without a library. So I went a couple of years ago, this is me and my husband, we went to Philadelphia. They have the Constitution Museum there, which I highly encourage you to visit if you have not been there. And as I'm walking along, learning about the Constitution, I see York County, and I immediately stop, because I'm like, York County, okay, what is this? And it turns out that they have on display the jurors' seats, that you can go and actually sit in them. I played musical chairs and sat in every single one. But it just shows you how important this trial was for them to have now put it in the Constitution Museum that we have here in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And also, so like one thing, you know, Dami and I are York Countyans, right?
Yes,
like
absolutely.
Born and raised here. And so I did some research, and my great-great-grandfather was a powwower, right? And so his name was Wilbert Zimmerman Eisenhower. He was my grandmother's grandpa. He lived over in Mount Wolf area. And so in your mind, when I was thinking what a powwower is, I'm picturing someone that wears rags, and it shows you my stereotype, right? Like I'm picturing kind of someone that lives in a little like hut in the woods that you visit them to drop off your bag of groceries, and they perform this practice on you. But my great-great-grandfather was the president of Mount Wolf School Board. He was the councilwoman at the borough. He was the commander of the Susquehanna Post VFW. He was a World War I veteran, and he volunteered for the fire company. Oh, he powwowed on the side, right? But this dude did a lot of stuff.
Doesn't sound so scary after all.
No. And so my grandmother, I remember, so I did my undergrad thesis on this. I went to York College, I got a degree in history, and I wrote my thesis on this murder. And I remember learning that my grandmother had been powwowed, or her brother. And I was teasing her for information, like, tell me about powwowing, this is fascinating. And her response was, all I remember is that there was a string involved. That was it. She wouldn't give me any more information. And I don't know, a part of it was, it's sacrilege at this point, right? It's negative, it's scary, it's something that taboo. A lot of people, taboo that people don't want to talk about. So on the other side of my family, when I was reading Ross McGinnis' book, there's a man named Charles Rissinger, and on my other side, my great-grandpa was Charles Rissinger. And so here's a picture of me as a little baby, 5-generation picture, and Charles Rissinger holding me. Now, I will say, after I did some more research, I found out there's 2 or maybe 3 Charles Rissingers in York County at the time. So I'm not 100% sure if my great-grandfather was one of those men that sat in the juror chairs.
1 in 3 odds.
Yeah, or just somebody else. I don't know. But I still think it's interesting, that juxtaposition of a juror and then a powwow doctor. So,
and they're all related to you, and you did your dissertation on the topic.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Kind of cool. Yeah, it is.
So now we're going to go over the sentences of the assailants. So first we have John Curry. So this was the youngest of the 3. And he got first-degree murder and a life sentence, but he only ever served 10 years of that. And he was released and ended up joining the United States Army. And he ended up being Eisenhower's staff cartographer. So he did make a career after committing a heinous crime. So, do with that what you will. But portraits hang in homes around York County, and this is a portrait that you would find hanging around York County. Then we have John Blymeyer, and he was convicted of first-degree murder and a life sentence, and this was the oldest member of the 3. He ended up serving 23 years of his sentence, and then it was commuted. He ended up working as a night watchman in Philadelphia, and he ended up living his life as a lonely recluse. McGinnis says that Blymeyer died as he lived, friendless and alone. So, if you believe in karma, maybe that's what got him there at the end.
And I don't know if we mentioned it either, but he was kind of the lead. He was the one who mostly organized it. Yeah.
And then we have Wilbur Hess. So you can see there that that's his tombstone. Oh, it's okay. And then we have a quote. So he served a second-degree murder sentence, and he served 10 years. But Gary Heinlein said, in the 1970s, I worked with Hess at McKay Company in New York, and Wilbert was a genuinely nice guy and a good employee. And I didn't know of his connection to the Hex murders until at the time when I worked with him. I believe that he had a son, Donald, and I think Wilbert was also a caretaker of a church in the area of Dead Man's Curve near Pine Grove. So here's someone who served time for murder, second-degree murder, and ended up having a family, having a career. He was a caretaker of a church of all things. And, no one knew about his past, really. I'm sure it's not something he advertised. So you have to wonder, if you find out that someone you work with is a convicted murderer of second-degree murder and served 10 years in prison, what would you think, to find that out about your coworker? Because by that point, you have your own impression of them. They thought he was a good guy and a good employee. So it kind of makes you wonder.
I wouldn't tell people.
No, I mean.
So now let's talk about the lessons learned, because we don't just want to be historians and tell you, here are the facts, and we want to actually get into, how do we interpret this? What does this mean? What are our takeaways? First is that we have some serious mental illness here, right? We've got John Blymeyer. When you look at his past and the way that he was never really a healthy person, he never really excelled, he didn't have a lot of friends. And so here we have Nelson Rehmeyer, this law-abiding citizen who died from home invasion because a man thought, and his two people that helped him thought that this was the only way that he was going to heal himself. And it was really, like we said, a terrible moment for the families. And there's a picture of Nelson Rehmeyer's wife. Yep. Ricky Ebal, he's also the great-grandson. He's still around, right? And so he is kind of the best-known descendant of this. And so as another thing to be careful of, too, when we talk about York County history, we're talking about people who are, alive. We're talking about the people, in history. And so Dami and I wanted to make sure that we didn't sensationalize tonight, that we just kind of told you, here's exactly what happened.
Yeah, when you're talking about topics and that person's great-grandchild can be in the room listening to you, you want to do it justice. But that brings us to York County's embarrassment, because like Jamie said earlier, this ended up making international news. And it's not necessarily the news that you want your town to make. You want to be known for great things, not for a murder. Right. So the worldwide coverage, back then it was newspapers, telegraph systems, and everyone really looked at this and said, look at those backward people. They were so superstitious and they were so paranoid that they killed a guy because they thought he was a witch. Yep. So, it's not really something that made us seem progressive or smart. Like Jamie said, we were kind of known as the place that turned down the Carnegie Library. So justice was served, and unfortunately then you have things like this with what was justice. Justice for the assailants were served, but the victim,
Well, and the stories that we continue to tell on Nelson Rehmeyer weren't good. Yep.
No, and it's not the first time or the last time that we were embarrassed. Jamie and I are fangirls for Lewis Miller, our favorite York County artist. But he's showing us that York surrendered to the Confederates. Pretty dang embarrassing, when you think about it. So then we have that. We have, other embarrassing things that happened. We have the Hex Murder. So York County was unfortunately making the news for things that weren't, the greatest.
And when the National Guard came in with the race riots, absolutely.
But then, we have two positives. So the Articles of Confederation were signed in York at the courthouse, the grounds of the History Center. And then we had the York Project, and we were really, helping during World War II, and our citizens came together to start making things like munitions and, helping with the economy at the time. So there were good things happening in York. It's just unfortunate that when media gets a hold of things and sensationalizes them, the bad things overshadow the good things.
Yep. Okay,
yeah. Yep. So, doing the right thing.
Yep. So when we look at Nelson Rehmeyer, he was recognized as a Christian, and so he was given a Christian burial at Sadler's Church near Shrewsbury, and the pastor there is known to have railed against any assailants that came and tried to disfigure the plot or sabotage it in any way. So we're happy that Nelson Rehmeyer is remembered in this positive way. The Reverend Bowersox, he was presiding over the funeral. He said it right. He said, "I am sure that the general light of this community is far above anything so dreadful."
That's a good way to put it, too. And then we have our redemption story. So Ross McGinnis, he really took up the mantle of this. And, he highlights that it's a moment when the York County court system did the right thing. It ran order through chaos, and ultimately justice was served at the end of this. So, and it goes to highlight how lawyers, when they're doing the right thing, can be power for good, but it also shows how they can kind of spin a tale, because Harvey Gross, he was brilliant for his advocacy, and Gross convinced the jury that Wilbur Hess, who was the third defendant, was the sacrificial lamb. So you'll notice that there was 2 people that got first-degree murder, and then there was 1 person that got second-degree murder, and that was Hess. Yep. And he had gone down to the Hollow to break the curse that was choking his family and would almost certainly destroy them. So, he was trying to be a sympathetic character to the jury and say, here is this young, impressionable man. He was doing something that he thought was right. He had no intentions of murdering him, and things just went haywire. So that just goes to show you, if you have a good lawyer, you might be able to get away with murder.
Yeah, and he played on the mom, too. He played the mom card really hard, but it works. Yep. There we got Gross got second-degree murder in spite of all the notoriety and publicity. Yep. So we also want to highlight, too, how dangerous information can change the way that we view the past. How many of you have read this book?
Ooh, a lot of people.
Yeah, a lot of us. So as you were reading it, I hope that you were picking up on a lot of grandiose claims, a lot of things that are rooted in a lot of folklore that were not based in fact, came out in 1969. So there's a historian named Sean Cohen who said that the name Nelson Rehmeyer really suffered because of this violence. And he said, just like the man himself, this misfortune springs largely from this book, wherein the author advocates Rehmeyer's murderer, John Blymeyer. So in the book, he really describes Nelson Rehmeyer as a black witch, that he afflicted others just for the sheer fun of it. And frankly, that's really not cool. This guy was murdered, and Lewis, when he wrote this book in 1969, really demonized this man. Yep. And so, like we've already said, Cohen said that Rehmeyer really should be remembered as a white witch. There's no evidence that he did anything bad or any type of black magic. And today, because of this book, all right, raise your hand. How many of you have been to Rehmeyer's Hollow, right, just driving around? Okay, let me rephrase it. How many of you have driven down just for the sake of being in Rehmeyer's Hollow because of this murder?
I want to know how many people went there at night.
Yep. Me too. I did too, right? And so we call this legend tripping. People go into the woods in the hollow where he was murdered, and they're looking for ghosts, they're looking for demons, supernatural amusements, which is very interesting. And I think it's interesting, but as long as you don't trespass, don't go on private property.
Private property, everybody. How many people have read Apprentice to Murder?
Watch the documentary.
So Apprentice to Murder, it gave a darker tale about Rehmeyer, and it really, a lot of false information in that as well. But a good source, a good one, is Hex Hollow documentary.
It's very good. It is on Amazon. Highly recommend it. Hex Hollow, an excellent good source of what happened.
So that leads us to the decline in powwowing, because, when things get a bad rap, unfortunately, they start to decline. So the target of the trio, Homan's Long Lost Friend, which was the book that we talked about, was a symbol of strain of white magic, and it had gone amok in York County. So people were looking at this and said, it got a guy murdered. I don't want to be caught with this book too, because what if someone comes after me? They said they needed this book and his lock of hair to break the spell. If you're caught carrying that, who's to say it's not going to happen to you? Watch out, man, with the book in the audience.
The books went in decline. And then finally, do we want to go back to what we call the good old days?
Yeah, so Ross McGinnis, that we've talked about, he's the authoritative resource on all of things Hex Murder. So he wrote the book, The Trials of Hex. So witchcraft, powwow, and the long lost friend were the customs of a rural society long since gone, which had no place in the 20th century. Yet here they were popping up like some mischievous jack-in-the-box that wouldn't stay put. Because honestly, it's a topic that people are really interested in. I mean, just the fact that this is our biggest in-person audience we've had maybe ever. So that just goes to show that this isn't a topic that's going to die.
So in the book, he finishes with this. He said, "Come back with me to an earlier time, a simpler time, a time before the Great Depression, before World War II, when many people throughout the land and in York County fervently believed that there were mysterious forces that were not of this world and not of human creation. It makes me want to read the book again. Like, it's such a good book.
Yeah, and of course, then there's been art that has been spawned from the Hex Murder. So this goes to show you the Hex Murder was simply dreadful. This is, I mean, pretty grotesque. I mean, it looks like there's a coyote or a werewolf figure there, and the red might be the fire, and there's an owl. You know, so that's a pretty spooky scene.
Yeah.
So those are the images that are conjured up when people think about the Hex Murder.
And then also, powwowing is kind of still practiced today in a way. So here's a picture of my mom and me. We're collecting echinacea, right? Does anyone know what echinacea is? It's coneflower, right? You've seen it around, I'm sure. How many of you have harvested for tea? Okay, some of you, yeah. So here you see my mom. She collects a lot of herbs for her tea, and there she's adding honey to it. So, I mean, tinctures and these herbal remedies, it's still kind of passed down to powwowing.
Yeah, so you can kind of think anytime you're using a home remedy, you know, you might be inspired by powwowing. Yep. Yeah.
So we encourage you, we're going to go to discussion here because I'm sure there's a lot of people that would like to share your own story. We also would like to hear your own story, but Dami and I do these videos and they're on YouTube, or you can check out Jim McClure and I's website, Witnessing New York, or our blog. So in Newberrytown, there's lots of different stuff going on.
Yeah, so now we're going to open it up to discussion because when I asked earlier, everybody put their hand up, so you better be ready to talk. So who wants to share their story of either they have an ancestor involved in powwowing, or they've witnessed powwowing, or they've been powwowed? I see some people giggling over here. I'm going to start calling on people that make eye contact with me. Anyone? Jim, would you like to be our cameraman and maybe turn the camera? Okay, I need a willing victim, please.
It's a good one.
We found one. Please tell us who you are and tell us your story.
Okay, I'm very familiar with this place. I was a baby, and I grew up in Sanders Church. Always heard the Rehmeyer story. Know where the cemetery is. And I had a picture of my mother sitting on the tombstone of Rehnmeyer's many years ago, back in 1930-something, right after he was killed. And we always heard the story of my grandparents' farm actually is adjoined to the cemetery.
Oh, okay.
Awry. My grandfather was awry. So he would often tell us about, I don't think it was Halloween, I would say maybe November, people would come to the cemetery and I guess they would do their thing, I don't know what they would do, but they were very loud and they left a lot of debris in the cemetery. Also, when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, I must admit I was a bedwetter, and my mother took me to the powwow, and I don't remember much of it, but it didn't work. He or she, I think it was a she, I can't remember that. It didn't really work at the time. I don't like that anymore.
Thank you for clarifying.
Oh yes, my mother had cancer at the same time, so maybe she went and took me, so we both be whatever. But anyway, that's my story.
Well, thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to share tonight?
Yeah.
How about maybe someone that has an ancestor that was involved with powwowing? The gentleman with the book.
Hello. Hello there. I'm Jeff Holder. I'm actually a retired West York teacher, history teacher.
Oh, nice.
Our ancestors probably were competitors. Have you heard of a John Schumacher? You look in there's a small little history book of Mount Wolf.
Okay.
He was down, he was a blacksmith, where the extension on the Georgia Pacific paper factories, his home used to live there.
Okay.
Or his home stood there. So he lived. Anyway, John Schumacher was one of the local powwow doctors in Mount Wolf at the time. Maybe they were different time periods. I don't know. But anyway, my grandmother was a big family historian, and kind of I bought the bug from her. That's why I have several vintage copies of this, because of course she talked about our ancestors as a powwower. On my other side, on my dad's side, my great grandmother, she was born 4th of July, 1900.
Wow.
And she passed away in 1993. And she did believe in powwowing. There's also some things in here, like, I read it myself, going back to read it. If you basically had an argument, a disagreement with somebody, they kind of got the last word, you've left feeling like, it wasn't really settled. You go home and you flip your clothes off inside out, and you put it in your drawer, and slam the drawer on it, and you're supposed to feel some physical pain when you got the last word. I don't know. But, my grandmother, her daughter, seriously believed that great-grandmother did use that approach. I don't know, but that's the story I always heard. So anyway.
There's going to be people going home tonight slamming their inside-out clothes in a drawer. So if anyone gets like a weird muscle ache, you know what's going on. Do we have anyone else that wants to share either a personal story or an ancestor that might have been involved in oh, we have someone up here, Jamie. Thank you for being willing to talk.
So I had an uncle who, as an infant, was sickly and had asthma, and they took him to somewhere in the Pigeon Hills or maybe somewhere in Hanover to a powwow late at night. And my mother is still alive, remembers going along for that, doesn't remember all the specifics. So somewhere back in the family, there were powwow believers and participants. And then she also told me that she had an uncle who did powwows, but he specialized in burns. So people would bring victims of burns to him for hands-on powwow healing.
That's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of a specialized powwower before. No, I mean, that's great. It would make sense that like a doctor, you might end up specializing in something.
Yeah. Does anyone know of a current practitioner of powwow? I don't either. And there's this, so my son is here, he was the one crying. That was my little guy. If Dami and I are still doing this in 50 years, what is the audience going to look like? How many people are going to say, oh yeah, I had someone in my family that was powwowed, unless you don't talk about it? So when you go back to your families this Thanksgiving or this Christmas, is this a part of the conversation, or is it still like it was 100 years ago and demonized, and we don't talk much about it? So does anyone plan on talking about this now on Thanksgiving? Yeah.
Hey, you have to now that Jamie said so. We've got another person willing to share.
My dad used to tell the story that he was powwow. As a young person, he had an inguinal hernia, and he said he remembered them taking him to a powwow doctor, and they rolled a cold egg over his stomach and said some words. 20 years later, he had a hernia operation. And the other thing is that he knew the career boy, and said he liked him and dealt with him in later life. He was an egg business.
Oh, wow. How about, does anyone in the room still use home remedies? Does anyone want to share maybe a home remedy that they use? Oh, we have a taker. This is my former childhood neighbor.
So my grandmother, when I would go to visit her, if we ever got a splinter, she would put a piece of raw bacon underneath the Band-Aid, and we'd go to bed with it like that. And there was something in the bacon that would draw out the splinter, and maybe we would take the Band-Aid out in the morning. It would be out enough, or out completely.
And it worked for you? I guess. I don't remember that in Long Lost Friends. I might have to go back and reread it, but I don't remember that. That sounds like she was making some stuff up, but it worked. So
maybe they need to add that to the second edition.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening to our presentation, but please don't go anywhere. We're going to set up with Cisco to give us about 5 minutes to transition, and then we will interview him about his work with the documentary. Thank you.
Good job, Jimmy.
Yay!